you've got an invalid login or you've got an invalid username. Okay, so if you were trying to run a brute force attack, that's pretty useful just to know which way to aim yourself. But actually, we've been beating on that drum for a while. We've been telling people that they should be using generic error messages, so you don't see that as often anymore. Okay, you don't get that in a large number of apps. But what is interesting is that you start to notice that there are subtle timing differences often present on login pages. It's just that for the most part, we actually haven't been paying attention to it. It's particularly prevalent, I used a big word, you see it a lot when hardware tokens are involved. Okay, and generally that's because a round trip time has to be made when there's a valid user as opposed to one that isn't made when the user doesn't exist. Okay, so we've set up an example of actually what we're talking about, okay, with some bank or the other, and its login thing. And the question here is whether you spot the difference. So we'll try a login for Bob, and we'll try a login for Marco. Okay, did any of you see the difference there? Okay, in this case, the application's giving us a whole 1 millisecond difference if Marco actually does exist or if Bob doesn't. And actually, we stole this live from some customer assessment that we were on, where we actually noticed this happening. Okay, and so what that puts us in the position to do is to come up with another badly chosen acronym or badly chosen tool name. So I'm going to kill this quickly and instead go to Python yet another time.pl. Okay, and this time we give it a names list, okay, and basically it's just going to try seeing how long it takes, seeing when it comes back, and decides if the user exists or not. From now we enter the realm of really dodgy scripts that may or may not work the first time, so you guys are going to have to bear with us. Okay, and what you should see there is the script actually trying to verify whether it's line noise or whether Marco actually exists. And I should do something that catches that error a lot better. Okay, and what you'll see down here is really simple. So not using any of Marco's histogram cleverness, it's just sending the request, deciding how long it takes, and deciding if the user exists on the system or not. Okay, so one of the reasons why that's really scary is, for one thing, we found it on a really popular banking site when we were doing this assessment. The second thing is, we took a look at a whole bunch of popular application scanners, so without mentioning names, and we looked at a whole bunch of their websites, and although lots of them punt every test or every sort of test that they're doing, not one of them made any reference to ever checking for anything timing related. Okay, so while it would make a big deal if you were returning different error messages for invalid login, invalid password, they absolutely just wouldn't notice if you were taking a full 5 milliseconds for valid users or invalid users. We've since put it into our Suru tool, but in honesty, we only put it into Suru after we started noticing this stuff happening. Okay, so if you're pen testing, you probably want to speak to your app scan vendors and see if they'll put the stuff in. So we start to go to timing and privacy on the web, or privacy. Okay, and you've got to come across the same origin policy. Okay, the same origin policy is pretty straightforward. It tries to make sure that scripts running from page A can't get data or can't get useful results from stuff that's happening in your browser on page B. Okay, so the question is, how did Jeremiah and them do their port scanning coolness? And Marco explained it to you. Basically, they said, run the script here, try to load something. If it didn't load, we can infer some information, and if it did, we can infer other information. So after port scanning, the guys soon went to history checking based on CSS. And like Marco said, Ed Felton, way back in 2000, started talking about privacy by timing loads. Okay, so graphically what Marco was talking about, the user browses my site, I drop down a Java applet to him, the Java applet decides that it took this long to fetch Scientology.org logo.gif, and has some sort of threshold. It decides that Scientology.org logo.gif came down too quickly, so therefore the user actually had visited that site before. Okay, so when we started playing with this, we thought we invented a new acronym until we Googled for it, and it turned out we were wrong. Okay, and what we started to ponder was the whole question of cross-site timing. So whether we could use my script to time your requests for other pages and how useful that would be. Okay, so like we said, Andrew Bortz this year, he's in the crowd, so you can buy him something, buy him alcohol afterwards. Okay, he wrote a paper discussing cross-site timing and its implications. And the attack that you end up with is pretty straightforward. So if you take the example of LinkedIn, the example down here is actually Facebook. Okay, if we made a request for facebook.com friends.php, if the user actually was logged into Facebook, this page would be returned to him. And if he wasn't, this page would be returned to him. Okay, and there'd be a very obvious timing difference in how long those pages take to come back to you. So you could pretty easily decide whether or not a user is or isn't logged in to some other site completely. Okay, so really simply, like I said, user visits us, we load these two pages, we make our call. One of the problems with this, again, is South African bandwidth. Okay, so in South Africa, someone loading Facebook takes a matter of minutes, and up here, someone loading Facebook takes a matter of milliseconds. Okay, so if you're trying this timing attack, you can't base it on a static number. Okay, so what we went for, and what Ports went for, was the concept of a base page. So in the Facebook example, you load a page that logged in and logged out users can fetch. You fetch the page only available to people who are logged in, and you calculate how long it takes between them. Okay, it gives you latency-resistant methods that should work. The question that has to happen is, what happens about cached pages? In our example, we load the page twice, just to make sure that the caching is not screwing you over. Okay, so the example that we used up here was basically figuring out if a user is or isn't logged in to a mailbox. Okay, and we have an example that almost always works. Okay, and if we just take a really quick, this is actually one of the other hard parts, getting squirrel mail working. Okay, so if some user happens to be logged into his mailbox account and then innocently visits your page or visits some page where you've had the ability to insert script, okay, what you'll find, what we're doing graphically here is we've loaded up 3 frames. The frame in one loads up the base page. In the second one, loads up the page that's his inbox and figures based on this amount of time that actually the user is logged into webmail. Okay, so we should be able to test this and sign out there. And if the user happened to visit this again, okay, you should find that it comes back and decides that actually the user isn't logged in. Okay, and at this point, somebody should be saying, wow, you can tell a user if he is or isn't logged in to a mailbox. Okay, that's supremely underwhelming. Okay, but obviously, just like we've got those 3 frames, in our example, actually what we're in a position to do is have it actually go back to an attacker completely. So in our instance, you'll find while the page is being visited, another request is being sent to the attacker that says this user is or this user isn't logged in at that point in time. Okay, so it's a pretty effective way of getting past, at least in a little bit, this part of the same origin policy. Okay, so let's quickly summarize. We know that some sites would tell you whether a user is or isn't valid based on timing. We know that most sites would betray a valid login from an invalid one based on some sort of timing. And we know that we can use your browser to time stuff while you happen to be surfing. We actually waited a lot for that. Okay? So it happily gives us cross-site request timing and then distributed cross-site request timing. Okay, so if we take it in stages, you'll remember that with timing.py, we could say, is a valid user on the system or not? Okay, we were then able to implement that in JavaScript. So if you remember the original Python script that ran, that decided that Marco was valid based on time, we've now got the ability to do this purely in Python and purely in JavaScript. And because we're doing it in JavaScript, we can do it on your box instead of on ours. Okay, you bump into a small problem with the granularity of the timer with JavaScript. So it's not going to give you a granular enough time source, which will be a problem if you're trying to time things. But fortunately, you'll remember that Marco spoke about extending Java applets, which the guys were using to get your local IP information. Okay, so it was being used for JavaScript port scanning. And we find that if you import from java.lang.system, you can pull in nanotime. Okay, and so what this means is instead of getting just 416, you're actually able to get a much bigger number, which looks more impressive, but actually essentially gives you a more granular time source. Okay, so if we then agree that the granularity problem doesn't exist anymore, you should see that we can easily go from timing.py to timing.js. Okay, and essentially what this should give you is the ability, and this thing almost always works, okay, it should give you the ability of having someone visit your page, and while they're visiting your page, you having them do the timing attack to mine for valid usernames on the bank site that happen to be betraying time. Okay, so let's see if my cut and paste actually works. Okay, so what you should see is a horrible time glitch. Let's try that again so that it at least looks better. Okay, so again, in this case, something that should be obvious before anyone asks me about it, we don't have to make any of those frames visible. Okay, so essentially what happened is someone visited our page, we sent them a bunch of usernames, they now trying that bunch of usernames against the bank site, and the moment they found a valid user in Marco, they get back to us and say, Marco actually is a valid user on that site. It's really cool for us, other than because we got to play the hamster music, okay? Because it starts to introduce the possibility of distributing your brute force attacks just via JavaScript. So if you happen to find a popular page on Reddit, like the hamster was at some point, or you get slashdotted, a whole bunch of people